Any questions? So, I touched on feelings before. My view is that addiction has to do with feelings that are out of control. I switched these around. Sorry, you're going to have to move around. The content's pretty much the same. And the next one's out of order too, so sorry. So these are some of the feelings that we are going to be trying to help our clients identify and own and shift in a positive direction. I referenced attachment theory earlier. If we grow up in a home or our early years are in a home where there's violence, where there's abuse between the parents, siblings, or the individual, a person is going to be having emotional issues well before they start school. And if you're 8 or 10 or 12 and you've made it that long and you have your first beer, it's like, this is what I need. Now, the 12-year-old, the 14-year-old basically says, I'm having a beer to have fun with my friends. And what they don't know is that that first beer, that first joint, that first pill, that first illicit sex is what it's doing is permitting them to cope or escape from the negative feelings that they've been carrying since mom and dad used to have knockdown dragouts when they were 4, and every night they were terrified that somebody was going to die, that mom or dad was going to leave, that somebody was going to come into their room and do that thing again, and they don't know. So when we're working with people with addictions, first, ideally, we get them to put down their drug of choice. And then, over time, we're getting them to identify and resolve these feelings that often preceded their use. Now, there's going to be some people that we work with that their low self-esteem, their guilt, their shame, their anxiety comes about largely as a result of their use. There are actually people that grow up in lovely homes where there is no abuse anywhere, and they end up addicted, and they end up conducting themselves in ways in which they don't approve. And if they do that, if they don't approve of stealing and they end up stealing, they're going to have a lot of guilt. If they end up, this is particularly true for women involved with opiates, what people do to get drugs leads to a lot of shame and guilt. That has to be ameliorated. 12-step programs is a very good way for that to happen, not necessarily trying to get people to talk about having been abused in groups of people, but joining groups of people where there are a lot of other people that have had similar experiences, some of whom have already taken many steps to deal with it, so they can lead, they can coach, they can support. And so it's not about, don't drink, don't take that pill, don't go sleep with that girl or that guy. It's about, how come I was doing that? What's going on here? And being able to identify, I can tell by that knot in my stomach that I'm afraid. I can tell by this tension here that something's going on for me. I just heard an F-bomb come out of my mouth for the 4th time in 30 seconds. When I hear that, that means I'm angry. And people learn from that what to do with it, and they get to shift out of it. But it takes time, sometimes not all that much, sometimes many, many years. So this actually comes from the sort of the AA rooms, the AA having the longest time in recovery and probably the most anecdotal stories. But one out of the AA literature, and I'm not exactly sure where, there's a line that says, addiction is about self-centered fear. Fear of not getting something you want or losing something you have. So what they're maintaining is being addicted to sugar, to sex, to booze, to opiates, isn't about sugar, sex, booze, and opiates. It's about the fear of something, in my view, having to do with the future, something, whether it's 30 seconds in the future or 3 years in the future. It's basically, I am not okay. and I'm not going to be okay. And that's why the alcohol, the pot, the whatever is so attractive, because you're unconscious, and it's generally your unconscious that is afraid. You're conscious, I'm cool, I'm good, I'm going to go hang with my peeps and, and do a bong. Not knowing that I'm terrified that I'm not performing well enough in school, I'm never going to get a job, and I'm never going to have any happiness. No idea. Self-centered fear. So that, and that is a framework, and it may not be, the predominant feeling for an individual may not actually be fear, but it's a good reference. Now, a lot of people, if you go hang out in 12-step groups, you're going to find people that are really angry. You're going to find people that are really depressed. You're going to find people that are very clearly anxious or fearful. You're going to find people that are totally checked out. And anhedonia was mentioned earlier. You're going to find people that haven't really experienced their feelings in quite some time. Now, from a societal standpoint, if you are working with somebody, let's say that you've got a lot of mandated clients, and if they stop using, it's better for society. If you get 10 people to stop driving drunk, it makes the community safer. But for what we do, I'm not involved in the legal justice system. What I want is the people that I'm working with to enjoy their life. Now, for them to do that, first they got to stop the booze, but then they've got to deal with the underlying fear, guilt, shame, low self-esteem, anxiety. And that is one of the reasons that the whole ongoing, so the marathon runner, you can become a marathon runner in a year or two. But to maintain a healthy lifestyle requires ongoing practice. So first we figure out how to develop the healthy lifestyle, then we maintain it. Another AA saying, an addict is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. How many people have heard that one before? Yeah. Does it make sense to you? You're simultaneously feeling better and worse than everybody. It's a nasty combination. Because when you have this dichotomy, when you have this split of, the way I view it is it's low self-esteem with compensatory arrogance or ego. When you have that, you don't belong anywhere. I don't hang out with those people. Well, those people would never welcome me. So you don't quite belong, and you spend your life trying to fit in, but you don't belong anywhere. So how do you, where do you belong? Well, I belong when I'm on my computer and I'm looking at this thing, or I'm smoking this, or I'm drinking that. That's the only time I have any peace, is when I'm doing this thing that gets rid of the low self-esteem and this other feeling that keeps me separate from others. And finally, addiction is a disease of isolation. The addicts are people who, when they're feeling lonely, will go off to be by themselves. And it's very common, and that ties into not feeling like they belong, not feeling like they fit in. So these are sayings that come out of the 12-step literature and informal conversations, not something that comes out of the mental health field or, strictly speaking, from research. But it's something that most addicts that I know of relate to, and it helps us as clinicians to go, oh, it's not about explaining to them that if they drink again, they're going to lose their job. It's like, well, when was the last time you felt really comfortable in your own skin? And helping them get to that place. So that's what we're trying to do, either in our offices or in the 12-step setting. Now, resentment. This is also out of the AA literature. It is plain that a life that includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. We found that it is fatal, for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. In another place in the literature, they say resentment is the #1 offender. The #1 reasons that addicts go back out and use is they get a resentment that they can't get over, and they use over it. And so they talk about using at people. I'll show you, And I'm sure that everybody in here has heard at one time or another that anger is a secondary emotion. Underneath or before anger is generally fear or hurt. Now, I simplify it to just talk about fear and hurt because you can be afraid of dying or afraid of looking bad. And I have a feeling that most addicts are going to be inclined to use over their fear of looking bad than over fear of dying. And so that is part of the work, is to help people see that and identify it. So anger is a secondary emotion. Underneath anger is fear and hurt. So when we're working with our clients and we're referring to 12-step programs, it says, what are you afraid of? How many have ever had a really angry client? It's like, oh my God, what am I going to do with this person? You know, where's the button? See, what I always tell people is, when you find yourself angry, ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What hurts? Well, I'm afraid I'm going to go broke. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I'm afraid my sweetie's going to leave. You know, I'm afraid that I'm going to get caught. I'm afraid. And damn it, it's your fault. And resentment is anger with legs. It's anger that sticks around. And a lot of recovery, when we get to talk about the fourth step in a while, we're going to talk about resentments. But a lot of this thing that they call recovery is about dealing with the negative emotions, and anger and resentments are two of the biggies. But underlying the anger and resentments is fear, hurt, low self-esteem, embarrassment, and those feelings that often come to us as small children, as teenagers, you know, going through the awkward stage, somebody being mean, somebody being a bully. And we have no idea that any of these dynamics are going on because everybody's been focused about what a jerk I am when I drink. So what, as clinicians, we can do is say, you're not a bad person. What's been going on is you've been trying to take care of yourself the best way you can, and it's maladaptive. So first, you put down the maladaptive coping mechanisms, and then you have to develop adaptive coping mechanisms. So when we get somebody to get off their drug of choice, where they get off the sugar, you know, they get off the booze, they get off the porn, they're naked. They got nothing. And so they're in a state of crisis, whether it's an obvious crisis or not, but their ability to be okay, to have inner peace, is very fragile. And so what we want to do, it's one of the reasons that we encourage, say, a lot of involvement with you know, their running group, a lot of involvement with 12-step stuff, and so they have support, so they have a safe environment, so that as they're going through these things, they're less likely to stress out and go back to whatever they were doing because they can't really think of anything else that'll work, and the pain is just too damn severe. So the first step, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and their lives had become unmanageable. So there's two parts to that. But before we launch into it, does anybody have any questions about anything so far? You good, Paul? Okay, all right. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. We admitted we were powerless over narcotics, our lives had become unmanageable. We admitted we were powerless over food, our lives have become unmanageable. That's just two parts. We're powerless over fill in the blank, and our lives have become unmanageable. And many people, when they end up in their first 12-step meeting, are able to buy one part of that or the other part of that. Oh yeah, when I do this, it's a problem. But my life's not unmanageable. My house is clean and neat. I go to work every day. My kids are doing fine, thank you very much. My life is not unmanageable. I don't belong here. Or when I do this thing, my life is definitely unmanageable. You know, when I do heroin, I steal stuff, or I don't show up for 3 days, or I don't bathe. That's unmanageable. But I'm not powerless because I've kicked it several times. You know, I just do it socially. And so part of what we're doing as clinicians when we had those people show up, some of whom didn't think that they had a problem, is what we're working to do is help people see things more accurately. I am not at all interested in making moral judgments on people's behaviors. If people want to have sex with random strangers, generally I'm okay with that. If they want to do drugs, I don't have a problem with that. If they want to drink, I don't have a problem with that. There are a lot of people that drink alcohol and don't have a problem. There are a lot of people that do drugs and don't have a problem. Some people do have a problem, and they're the ones that we're focusing on. And this term denial comes into play, because when people do have a problem, they quite often are not consciously aware of it. They, as the lady in the back said, they might be unconsciously aware of it, but they're often defending themselves and protecting their ability to use unconsciously by not really accurately seeing what's going on. So what we try and do as clinicians is expand their awareness. When one's doing a simple assessment for addictions, is it a problem in your legal life, your physical health, your relationships, your financial life, and I think your work life. Simple expansion. Now, when people come to us, well, at least when they come to me, they generally have a problem in one area of your life. I'm smoking too much pot and I'm not really getting the resumes out the way I want, or I'm not studying the way I want, or I'm drinking some and my husband thinks that I'm drinking too much, and every other area it's fine. Or I got a DWI, but I've never missed work, the family's doing well and I've got money in the bank. So part of what we do is we use that framework of the 5 different areas of life and say, okay, write down where it's been a problem here, there, or the other place. Now, in the 12-step setting, what they would have you do is they would have you do what's called a written first step. Written first step is you write down every time that your consumption of this or your involvement in that ever caused you a problem. And you ask people that and they say, oh, I couldn't do that. That's fine, because it doesn't have to be everything. But what you're trying to do is raise a person's awareness and have them see their life more accurately. So the 12-step people have been doing that for a whole lot of years. So people show up in NA or in your office because they finally ended up in the hospital, or they ended up getting caught stealing, or they did this one thing. And so you sit down and say, okay, I know you don't have a problem, and what I'd like you to do is write down every time your pot use, your alcohol use, your drug use, your sexual behaviors ever caused you a problem. When did you ever use when you said you weren't gonna? When did you use more than you planned? When did your use affect your finances, your career, your relationships, your physical health? When did you conduct yourself in ways of which you don't approve? We all know how much unwanted sex there is on college campuses, and how often it's alcohol and drug related on one or both parties' parts. That's significant stuff, and people often, it's not in their consciousness. Now that was 10 years ago. That wasn't a problem. It was, well, yeah, we lost 3 girlfriends because you were such a drunken jerk. My problem didn't start at 30. It started at 18. And that is what we as clinicians are working on, and that's what the 12-steppers do. And so you can utilize that framework to help your clients gain the self-awareness that they need to have, so they can start making the changes they need to have. Rather than, I'm just going to cut down to 3. Okay. Now so the wording there is, we admitted we're powerless. If you end up going to 12-step meetings, they're going to talk about 2 other concepts. They're going to talk about surrender, and they're going to talk about acceptance. And the surrender idea, I think, is really important. And I've been thinking about this particular piece for quite some time. I have seen people surrender without any therapy and without any 12-step stuff. They get a DWI, they're going to be on paper for a year. They're going to be on probation for a year. And I am not drinking, I am not doing any drugs while I'm on paper. That is a surrender in the way that I'm about to explain, because they have clearly made a commitment to themselves without any reservations. I'm not using. Not necessarily copping to having a problem or this and that. I'm just not doing it. Now, often those people, the day after they get off paper or the day they get off paper, they're using again. Not always. Sometimes it's an immediate problem. Sometimes it evolves into a problem if they really have addiction issues. But for that period of time, there really wasn't much question for them. Now, they also might be what's called a dry drunk. And I'll reference that a little later. But anyhow, they're not using, and it's not really much difficulty. But surrender for our purposes is trying to help people become emotionally, or emotionally and spiritually, if you want, whole. The way I think about it is when people decide, I've got a problem with porn, I've got a problem with booze, I need to quit because it's not working well. The fun is pretty long gone, and I really need to, I think they're right. I need to quit. And then they come and they talk to us, and they try to quit drinking. They try to quit drugs. Now, classic thing is try to quit drinking and start smoking a lot of pot, doing substitution. Or they go off heroin and start smoking a lot of pot or drinking a lot. Very common, not terribly helpful, but very common. Now, what's going on for that person? Different from the guy that got the DWI, is when they're trying to not use, they've got an unconscious conversation going on inside their head virtually all the time of, I am never going to drink again unless I get cancer. I am never going to drink again unless something happens to my kid. I am never going to drink again unless this thing happens. And when that conversation is going, again, unconsciously, they're not trying to shine on the clinician, and they're not trying to shine on their sponsor. This is just this thing that goes on with us. The unconscious is a very powerful thing. And remember, the alcohol or the drugs or the whatever is the only thing that really ever led this person to feel comfortable in their own skin. And so they're done unless. And as long as that they would call that reservation is there, there's a high probability that, one, they're not going to get the emotional relief that they need to by sitting in meetings for a long time, and two, they're not going to get that inner peace that I would want people to get, not through any fault of their own, but just because, remember, we're dealing with feelings, but that hasn't shifted, and that thing that they call surrender hasn't happened. And I don't know any way to make that happen. I do know ways to stack the deck in favor of that happening over time. And to a large degree, that's what we're working on, is we're trying to stack the deck and increase the probability that a person will get to a point of being trying to not use person to, I am an addict in recovery. I no longer use. I am not going to, if my loved one dies, it is my intention as I stand here right now to not use over that, rather than to have a question mark of what will happen. It's a subtle distinction, and working with it takes some time, but it really is important. Now, people can surrender and then no longer be in that state. It's one of the reasons that it's encouraged for people to keep working on their emotional stuff, because so that they can continue to be balanced. And I knew this one guy that in AA said that he'd had long-term sobriety. He had long-term sobriety, and he said, the reason that I do the 12-step thing is, I spent a lot of time trying to not drink on my own. Eventually, I drank it. I was never comfortable during that period of not drinking. So I drank again. It got really bad. I became teachable for a while. He opened up to the concepts that we're talking about, and his life started to get better. He said, luckily, I noticed my life started getting better. So decided to keep doing it. And that's a lot of what we're talking about is, you know, you do the work, you have the change, and then you maintain it. And what happens is when people don't maintain it, this guy said, he said, you know, one of my beliefs is that if I stop going and doing the recovery thing, is that over time, the practice that he has will start to diminish. And as it starts to diminish, all these lovely people in the world will start to become assholes. And he said, and then all the people in the 12-step, you know, will start to become assholes. And when everybody in recovery starts to become assholes, I'm about to drink again. So what he's talking about is going from emotionally centered and balanced to no longer being centered and balanced and no longer having access to the means of reacquiring the center and balance by whatever it is that a person does to basically that thing that they do to acquire the balance that at one time when they're 16 or 22 or 30 that the booze or the drugs or the sex or the sugar gave them. Acceptance, the way I think of that is very similar to what we're talking about with surrender. And the way I think of it is when people come to your office and go, I got a problem, I got to quit drinking. They are not thinking, or I gotta quit the pot. I gotta quit. My wife's going to leave me if I don't stop the porn. They're not thinking, oh boy, my life's about to get better. They're thinking, my life is over. The only thing that ever worked for me, I have to give up. And so the acceptance thing is, instead of going, I have this problem, I need to do the right thing, therefore I'm never going to have fun again and my life is over, is it's got to shift to, I have this thing going on in my life and that's okay. This is the way things are. One person told me once that acceptance is when you stop trying to have a better childhood. You know, it's because we wander off into the future and the past. I'm not okay. You know, I got screwed. You know, this isn't right. So acceptance is seeing things as they are and doing what you need to because you choose to, rather than because somebody's making you a victim. So yeah, I think I sort of beat out the subtle and profound change. Now, going back to the definition of cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of what's going on there is changing the self-talk, the conversations that a person has with themselves about themselves and what's going on. It's not particularly about, you know, I've got 37 days that I didn't drink. It's that self-talk. I didn't drink and I'm screwed, so I didn't drink, and that's pretty good. I think I might take up skydiving. You know, so what we're trying to engage in is get that person to shift out of the self-talk that led them to get into trouble and to stay in trouble into a place of, oh, there is life after this. I can have fun. I can learn stuff. I can make some money. You know, I can have a relationship. It's a huge change. And then that grows from there, from changing that self-talk to actually interactions with other people, which also many of our clients have a few deficits in. And first order change versus second order change. That's another way to think about what we're talking about. First order change, you put down the crack. Second order change is when you're not pissed off about it anymore. Second order, in an education model that I stumbled across it online somewhere, is a four-step approach to change, or to learning actually in this case, that I think is very apropos. The first stage is unconscious incompetence. We're incompetent and we don't know it. Second stage is conscious incompetence. Still incompetent, but now we know it. I don't have a problem, and engaging in behaviors that aren't helpful. Second stage, oh, still engaged in behaviors that aren't helpful, but I know it. Third stage is conscious competence. So now I'm doing what I need to do. I'm not making things any worse. I'm starting to make some progress in the right direction, paying down the bills. You know, I maybe got the kids back, you know, whatever. And finally you get to unconscious competence. So we extinguish the old habits, we've replaced them with new habits. And that's what we're working on. And that fits in with the concept of dry versus sober. How many of you, prior to getting any education about addiction, would think, well, if I am a person that has not consumed any alcohol for 2 weeks, or I haven't consumed any nicotine for 2 weeks, or I haven't consumed any sugar for 2 weeks, that I'm a sober person? It would make sense to me. None of the substance in me, I'm sober. In the addictions field, dry versus sober. Dry, free from the behavior or the substance. Sober is when you're comfortable in your own skin, when you're not engaging in that behavior or the substance. Very big difference, profound difference. Sometimes it comes quickly, sometimes it takes a long time. And people do, they slide back into being dry. You know, they get a second job, they have a health problem, they have some financial problems, and they go back from emotionally balanced to emotionally troubled, and it's a danger time. And one of the reasons, again, you keep people connected with a recovering community, so when they head in the wrong direction, they go and they sit in one of those chairs for a while, and somebody goes, you know, I've been a raving lunatic, you know, these past 2 weeks, and I realized it is because, you know, I was using shopping therapy and I can't afford it. I think, oh, okay, and they make the change in a positive direction again. Now we get into the God stuff. This is a big problem for many people. I'm mostly a Buddhist, so the God stuff isn't exactly my thing, but it's not a barrier for me for working with people. So the step is, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And if you work with clients that are starting 12-step stuff, and they'll come in, they've been to a few meetings, and they go, yeah, you know, the first step sort of makes sense to me. I'm having a real hard time with the second or third step. It's like, I don't know how a person cognitively works them into believing that some power is going to take care of stuff. Because basically what you're dealing here is with feelings. Now, my view of what this is about is what it happens a lot with people as they go to 12-step meetings, and also when they go to therapy. Excuse me. They show up in your office, or they show up in a 12-step meeting, and excuse me a sec. And their life is over. They gotta show up because they were mandated. They gotta show up because they made a commitment to. They gotta show up because when they left rehab, they made it. They were told they had to do it, and their spouse said, "You can't live here unless you do it." But their life is over. And then they sit in, and it often happens in meetings. Sometimes it happens in literature. Sometimes it happens when people, they go out for coffee. Sometimes it happens in the therapist's office. It can just as easily happen in a therapist's office as in a 12-step environment. But what's sort of a common thing to have happen is a person's there and they're relatively miserable. And somebody starts talking. You know, there's different formats for meetings. There's speaker meetings, and there's discussion meetings, and there's literature meetings. The discussion meeting is, they ask for a topic. How do you stay sober when your boss is a jerk? And they talk about how they stayed sober when their boss was a jerk. And it can be, and that will wander all over to the various steps and traditions and things like that. But what will happen is the newcomer will be sitting there wishing they were dead, and somebody will start talking and people start laughing. And they'll talk about how they got fired from 3 jobs after they got sober or something like that. And instead of everyone, oh my God, that's terrible, everybody's just cracking up because everybody gets it. And the person that's sitting there hopeless, often without knowing it, because again, we're dealing generally with the unconscious, they start feeling a little better. Without knowing it, they start getting, these people are laughing. I'm not laughing. These people said they've been doing this stuff. I haven't been doing this stuff. Maybe there's a chance that my life will get better. Now, sometimes it remains unconscious, but instead of zooming out the door 5 minutes before the meeting is over, they stick around 5 minutes after, they go have coffee, and they find out that somebody likes to go fishing, and they go fishing with them or something like that, and they get a little hope. And that, to me, is all the second step is. No theology is required. If somebody acquires theology, I'm fine with that. But it's not required. What we're dealing with in these steps, to a large degree, is cognitions, behaviors, and feelings, not theology. Now, you are getting my opinion. One sec, Paul. You are getting my opinion. So if you try and convince a sort of a fundamentalist 12-stepper that this is correct, you may be in for some difficulties. However, you can use this and you'll get a whole lot of people say, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I did think about it. I do think about it that way. I never thought of it that way, but it's cool. That's good. So you're not going to be effectively fenced off, but you will have some people that go, I never heard of that. Paul?
Well, an interesting thing I heard.
Oh, thank you.
Just like that?
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
And it kind of relates to what this lady was talking about earlier. You were saying the person was sitting there and they heard people laughing.
Yes.
So instead of power, they thought that there was an energy in the room.
Yeah.
And they thought for 1 minute, well, maybe I could become part of that.
Correct.
That is not just me, that's whole greater than the sum of its parts.
Sure.
There's an energy.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like a beautiful thing that could happen.
Yeah, and it can, does. And the detail, and
the other part
yeah.
of this I just want to throw out and mention is eternal gaslight is the subject of, in our offices, of dreams and dream material when it comes, because it can surprise you and it could be useful. And how it's useful, we all know there are a lot of schools, the way to look at that material. But, so I respectfully just throw that out there. And wondering, maybe sometimes it means when you're telling your story, whether it's poetic or it's a narrative or it's a dream or it's about some ray of light that happened. Okay.
You're absolutely, and just as a footnote in that regard, is it's not at all uncommon in 12-step meetings for people to bring up dreams as a topic, often because they had using dreams. Sometimes because their dreams have just gotten really bizarre. Of course, this happens quite often when people get on antidepressants. But it's, people talk about the processing. And, insightful people will say, well, we don't really know what your dream means, but it's very possible that what you're doing is you're processing information in your sleep that is still too dangerous for you to process consciously. And the outcomes of that varies person to person. And the dialogue that a person will have with themselves as they sit there and hear the laughter will vary significantly person to person. But what's happening is an unsticking emotionally, conscious and unconscious. Go ahead.
I just want to recommend one other thing.
Okay.
That came to me. So there's a song, it's called Lost in the Stars by Kurt Weill. And this song, Lost in the Stars, says, we're all just an atom here anyway. Mm-hmm. And I think it would help those people who don't want to have anything to do with the theology. If they just would listen to Judy Garland or somebody else sing Lost in the Stars and cry a little bit, but it would be good effect.
If you were to go to meetings, you would hear someone say that. Or that quote, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So I think that the connection, if you were kind of connected to something I said, I didn't want to keep talking, but what Buddhism would talk about is impermanence, and that everything is changing. And I don't know if that's something that you want to necessarily introduce to everyone who walks into your office, but it's something that I think is helpful for a therapist to think about, and for me to read about, how our perception, it just keeps changing. And it's like the stars, you see them one night and you see them the next night, and you see them from Australia, and that kind of, I think, helps us as therapists see, what the
The relative part to that, to impermanence, there's an AA slogan. We'll swing by it later. It's one day at a time. And the way I view that is that's code for be here now, to live in the present, which speaks to the concept of impermanence. One of the reasons that people are addicted is they're in this space of attachments, the thoughts, the behaviors, the consumption, the attachment to the story of what their life is about, why it's a problem. And a lot of this thing they call recovery is about letting go of those attachments and becoming comfortable. You'll hear a saying in the 12-step groups is the only constant is change. That speaks to impermanence. The language is a little bit different, but the concepts underlying are exactly the same. And what we want to do is frame the underlying concept in a language that our clients are open to. And if it happens to be the language of Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or some more secular philosophy, what the hell? But what we're trying to do is open them up to be able to have a fuller picture of their life. And yes, ma'am.
Not to monopolize it, but one of my clients who's used 12 steps most radically struggles now with this, environment, which is so different from what how the world has come to look for him now. So although, there's been very radical change, being in that environment, not necessarily a drug environment, but just a cultural environment, that's very different from what something anonymous group can lead you to is a next step.
I think the way I would address that is yet another saying is go to any lengths. The 12-step programs, as a rule, encourage people to pursue whatever spiritual or religious frameworks work for them. And I think it's up to people. In June, I'll be leading a retreat in Vermont on the 12 steps from a Buddhist perspective. It's not as different as one might suspect. There's more open-mindedness in the 12-step groups than in most environments, although sometimes that's obscure, and sometimes you can be in an environment where that's not actually the case. Any questions or comments? So that's the second step. No theology required. A feeling shifts at some point from being hopeless to having a little sense that maybe things can get better. So the third step, now this is where people really get into trouble. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Now how that we understood Him got thrown in is when the AA Big Book was being written, there was one salesman who really, matter of fact, many of the early AA members had a lot of difficulties with religion. They, I think 6 of them had, parents that were ministers or something, and they were really pretty anti things. And so there was a lot of debate about that, especially with them coming out of the Oxford group. And so when they were very focused on the God stuff, and there was one salesman in particular who just couldn't have it, and that was how, as you understand them, came into being, was to accommodate this one gentleman. As is often the case in 12-step groups, they really work diligently to try and get input from everybody, and in fact have a tradition of trying to listen to minority opinion. Not necessarily the way things are done everywhere else. But that's how God is, we understand Him, came to be. And you will hear, if you were to go to AA, you will hear all sorts of discussion about what it means and what it has to be. And you'll hear people saying you can choose a doorknob as a higher power, and then you'll hear people get really angry about that being said and say, no, you can't do it. And if you happen to get sober in Louisiana or Kansas, you're going to say you got to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. You're not getting sober. And it's just the way. Now if you go to Indonesia, you're going to have a lot of people in recovery that never heard a Christian prayer. And there are a lot of people in all different parts of the world with very different cultural and theological backgrounds that are getting sober using the 12 steps. And they actually rewrite the literature in different languages. Many people in the U.S. don't actually realize that this happens. But they fine-tune things to actually make sense for the different cultures. So they really work very diligently to be open-minded and accommodating. My view of the third step is that there's two parts, faith and footwork. More accurately, footwork and faith. And how I think about it is, and I heard a guy say a long time ago, is that the third step is about faith and footwork. And what it's about is making a commitment to do the rest of the steps, or making a commitment to do the stuff that the people who are going to the meetings say that they do, a little more broadly, because it doesn't just have to do with the 12 steps. And then from my view as a clinician, what happens is if you have somebody that's been doing opiates and stops, or they've been eating a dozen donuts a day, or they've been engaged in an eating disorder, and they get their eating under control. They start eating in a healthy way, maybe have some exercise. What happens to these people when that starts? Is their life starts getting better. Now, people don't necessarily notice. Now, so the classic drunk, they stop getting arrested. They get a job and they hold on to it. They may get the girlfriend or the boyfriend back. They may get the kids back. There's stuff that to other people is obvious. It's improvement. They get off paper. There's objective stuff. But what I always say is, if you start doing this stuff, your life is going to get better. And then I say, and if you're lucky, you'll notice. Because a whole lot of people, their life starts to get better, but they don't notice. And the reason they don't notice is they're so habituated to have things go wrong. And this started when they were 4, and every third night something bad would happen. Or it started when they were 12 or when they were 18. They're so habituated to the bad stuff that they don't notice the good stuff. The good stuff in their life does not get into their long-term memory, doesn't get into their hard drive. Those people are going to relapse a lot. And those people are going to need a lot of encouragement to develop the ability to notice the good stuff in their life. So it's not just a reframing. What it is consciously working with your clients to help them develop a new competency, the ability to notice. Now, how they do that, and I probably have this somewhere in another note, they'll often say, do gratitude lists. It sounds like a la-di-da thing, do gratitude lists. But what's going on with the gratitude list? And I do think there's a biological imperative to this. A million years ago, it is like, if I don't get a rabbit, I'm going to starve to death. So there's this thing. We focus on what's missing or what we're afraid we're going to lose. Going back to addiction is about self-centered fear. If I don't get the rent, I'm doomed. If I don't get this, so we're focused on what we don't have, or what we're afraid we're going to lose. And when good stuff happens, I got to kiss my kid goodbye today. I got the report from the doctor. I'm okay. The car actually started. This and that. None of that gets into long-term memory. The only thing that we remember is the car radio doesn't work, and I should kill myself. Deeply ingrained habit. So you do gratitude lists, and you list 10 things a day for a couple years of stuff that's going well. The wiring starts to change. The functional MRIs are again, they're showing this. But we need to encourage our clients to more skillfully see what's actually going on in their life versus the story they always told themselves. So what happens here? You start, sort of straightening up, and just behaviorally, you're more in line with what the rest of the world thinks would be a good idea. So you have less negative drama. And then over time, what happens is you develop the feeling of experiential faith. I am not talking about faith as a theology. I'm not talking about I've accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior, therefore I'm going to heaven. I have faith, I believe. That's an intellectual construct or a theology. May or may not be true, I don't know. But I do know that most addicts have a profound faith. They have a faith that things are bad and they're going to get worse. And then they conduct themselves in such a way that contributes to that. It's not necessarily the whole thing, but it contributes to it. And so what we're trying to do is help them shift the way they're behaving in ways that lead to less negative outcomes, and then help them realize that, to notice it, and take that faith that they always had and flip it to the other side of the coin to, instead of I am fundamentally not okay and I'm never going to be okay, is fundamentally I am okay. And if I keep doing this stuff, I have a good chance of remaining okay. Now, personally, and this I sometimes floor people with, but this includes up to and including dying. Because we're all going to die. And it's reasonable to argue that people end up addicted because they can't face the prospect of dying. May or may not be true, especially unconsciously. I wouldn't really argue it too strongly. But ultimately, what I want to have for the people that I work with is I want people to have the ability and inclination to enjoy their life rather than live in fear of death. Given the awareness, I'm not encouraging them to repress, suppress, or deny the fact that we're going to die. But I want them to be open to the possibility of enjoying life here and now. Enjoying life when we lose the job, when probation has been extended for 2 more years, when, it's a huge change for people. So what we're encouraging, as clinicians, what I think we can do is help people avoid the very understandable trap of I can't do the 12-step thing because it's too God-oriented. And at the same time, not throw away the steps themselves. Say, look, this is how I interpret it. And it's a help. And part of the reason I'm doing this is I view that the remaining steps are largely cognitive behavioral therapy, and which you'll be able to see more clearly when we get to them. But this is opening up. So, okay, I'm going to do this stuff. And I'm going to do it to Tommy.
Yes. I know it's a question, just a reflection. I'm mindful of the intersectionality between survivor guilt, self-sabotage, and the ego.
Well, yeah, I can talk about survivor guilt and self-sabotage. I actually have sort of a hard time skillfully talking about ego. So I don't a lot. It's not that I think there's another construct that's better. I'm just not that good with it. But
Set me up for curiosity now. The concept later.
Okay. Many people end up addicted. The people that came out of Vietnam are, classic. I mean, there's so much survivor's guilt for those that live. And we're seeing it so much for people coming out of the Middle East. And God only knows for the people that are all still stuck in the Middle East. And many of those people end up with addictions. Because basically, it's one of the ways I think about addiction is that, remember the 3 things: learn to live in the present, bring your life into your conscious awareness, and stop leading a fear-based life. And as the woman in back says, we're talking about impermanence. Well, what happens for the addict is they're not able to be present. They have attachments to the story. I'm bad because I survived that. I'm bad because I did that thing. I'm bad because I didn't do that thing. And my future, I am never going to be okay because I have proof from the past that I'm not going to be okay, or because this is... So we're not able to live in the present. Now, I believe this is the human condition. I don't believe this is what's, is pathological. I think it's the human condition. Now, addicts pick up the booze, pick up the sex, pick up the pot, pick up the thing, because it gets rid of the future and the past for a while. It doesn't exactly get them present, but, and I'm not particularly talking about the consumption of the substance or engaging in the behavior. Part of it is simply the ritual of going to the kitchen where you have the liquor and the beautiful bathtub glass, or going to your neighborhood bar, or rolling your joint, or doing whatever it is when you, the bad day disappears, there is no tomorrow. This is not oblivion, substance-induced oblivion. This is just this emotional, unconscious thing that happens and it happens and it happens. Nicotine is the worst. I mean, people, everything that they do in their life revolves around, the cigarette. Before sex, after sex, before. I used to love smoking cigarettes after the gym. I'd work and I'd run and I said, yeah. I had no idea. I thought it was because I was addicted to nicotine. The physiological addiction to the nicotine is gone within 2 weeks, and a little shorter than that usually. Same thing with the opiates, the acute withdrawal, 2 weeks. Booze, acute withdrawal, 2 weeks. Psychological stuff, sometimes forever. So what we have to do, we get them to stop the maladaptive coping mechanism that they've been using to get rid of the future and the past, and then we have to help them learn adaptive coping mechanisms so that they live in. And that takes time, and what they do is going to vary person to person. What works the best and at different times. But that's what we're after, is helping a person show up here and be at peace without the substances or the behavior. And to do that, we've got to deal with all these feelings that have started to come up in unhelpful ways. And survivor's guilt is a classic example of one of the things that can do that. Yeah?
So I'm thinking about step 2 and 3 in terms of people's objections to God talk is often, it seems at least partly also just like the resistance in general to, to recognizing there's a problem, and then they can just very easily say, well, I can't do that. Can you speak, I don't know, to addressing that or to that dynamic?
The one thing I can do is agree with you, is that often happens, and if it is happening, there's a very good chance they don't know that's what's happening. I have strong beliefs. The one thing I'm not going to be is a hypocrite. I don't believe in God, and I'm not going to start praying to him, her, or it now to deal with that. And those people are like that. When really what's going on is their unconscious is they're trying to make you quit using. And that is the worst idea I've ever heard. So one of the things that I always do is I try and develop and maintain a rapport with people. So if they won't do the 12-step thing, they'll keep seeing me. Maybe not see me rarely straight through, but when the next drama happens, that they'll come back. One of the things I do with that, and I'm probably going out of order again, but that's okay. I do a lot of future predicting. I got it from the Grateful Dead. And you remember the line and their song is, "I can tell your future, just look at what's in your hand." Future predicting is a critical part of treatment for addicts and alcoholics. I mean, some people show up and they're ready, but most people show up somewhere between there is no problem and I sort of have a problem and I'll figure it out, and with the clear understanding that the issue is the use of this substance rather than the underlying feelings. And just because I say, nah, that's not the way I think about it, they're not necessarily going to buy into that or even hear it. Because one of the things people have to do, remember, for the addict, the most important thing in the world is protecting their ability to use. And so a good way to do that is, is have barriers up for incoming information. The way they talk about it in the rooms is, I wasn't teachable. And that's why they say you got to hit bottom. When people, one of the concepts along with hitting bottom is that it hurts so badly that the defenses fail. When the defenses have failed, they're teachable for a while. Usually 24 to 48 hours in my experience. If I get somebody in crisis, if I can get in my office within 24 or 36 hours, I have a much higher probability of helping them along the path than if it takes 4 days. 4 days? Yeah, it was bad, but I've worked it out. So the future predicting, I can tell you the story. I have the person's permission. Is I had a high school kid brought to me by mom from up the lake, not from this town, and sort of a redneck, nice kid, you know, pickup truck, baseball bat in the back, liked to drink, liked to do drugs, liked girls. They sort of liked him, except for when he was an ass. And he, you know, he didn't really have a problem. He sort of liked me, and he, you know, he would come back. And after a few sessions, and in between the sessions, stuff would happen, and he'd go, "Oh, you're right, that happened." And so he finally said, "Okay, I'm ready and to quit drinking and quit doing drugs." I said, "Good. That's a good idea. You'll be a lot better." And so he said, "I'm going to quit, and my girlfriend's going to quit." And she thought it was a good idea because he really was a jerk when he drank. And so they came in 2 weeks later. They hadn't had a drink or a drug in 2 weeks. And they said, "Thank you very much for helping us. We don't need to see you anymore." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." I said, "However, if you really have a problem with alcohol and drugs, this is what your future holds. If you really have a problem," this is not true if they don't really have a problem. "If you really have a problem, the next time you're in an office like this, or the next time you're in this office, either the police or the hospital are going to be in your life." And they said, "No way. Because you've taught me a lot, I know." And interestingly, you can hear examples of this in the AA Big Book, because, you know, same thing 80 years earlier. But I said, you know, the next time, you know, you're in here, the police or the hospital will be in your life. About 6 months later, I got a phone call from the kid. He wanted to come in and have me sign a release so I could talk to his lawyer, because he pulled a felony charge in another city. And I said, "I will not sign that unless you come in here and talk to me and bring your mother." He came in, he brought his mother, told him and mom the same thing. Is if you don't do treatment, because he's now that this has happened, I can't use because I'm going, I got a felony charge. I'm going to. So he said, "Okay, if you don't get into recovery, really more accurately than treatment, if you don't get into recovery, the next time I see you, either the police or the hospital are going to be in your life. No way, not after this charge, not after what I've learned." So a few months later, I got a call from 2 North, the Cayuga Medical, the psych ward. So-and-so is about to be released. He says he's a client of yours. And I'm going, shit, I hate it when that happens. Yeah. and so he didn't want a therapy yet. He had it figured out. Now, meanwhile, his felony charges are moving along, and he's trying to plead them down to a misdemeanor, because felonies are a bit of a problem. His particular one was really interesting. I won't tell you what that was, but it was embarrassing. But he wouldn't listen. I told him his future. If you do not get into recovery, the next time I see you, either police or the hospital are going to be in your life. Next phone call I got was from 2 North. He had been taken there with alcohol poisoning from Slope Day, and he was still in high school. Now, the bad news was he had just about negotiated away his felony charges. That blew that, but he did decide to get into recovery. He came and saw me. We met a few times because of the circumstances. I was not interested in doing outpatient, got him into inpatient. He went to Tully Hill, and he went directly from Tully Hill to jail. He stayed sober in jail, and he stayed sober since. And I see his mom at hockey games once a year. And she goes, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." But that is what we're doing. What we're doing is we're trying to help people move along this path from total denial to emotional balance, to inner peace. And that's what we're after. It's too much to conduct in a therapist's office, in my view. And the 12 steps work better. But so the people, they're just using it as a way to cop out. Yeah, that's part of the process. It's okay. If you raise that as conjecture of possibility of what's going on, and I wouldn't worry about it. And the last thing you want to do is try and get somebody to agree with you that that's what's happening. Yeah, but yeah, that will be happening a lot. Like the woman who wrote that thing, she went through. I'm good, I'm smart, I'm a professional, I'm this and that, all of which was true. But she didn't know that what her addiction was about, it was only a few years old, had to do with earlier life, emotional stuff that she had never dealt with, and the simply stopping the drinking didn't address. Anybody else? So this is where the cognitive behavioral stuff really takes off. So I'm going to start this, and then we're going to break for lunch. You have on your handout, there is part of page 65, I think, yeah, 65 of the AA Big Book. It's called the Big Book. And so that page comes from a chapter 5 of the AA book. It's called How It Works. And this is where they're encouraging people to deal with some feelings. And to me, this is a critical part of the beginning of the emotional change. Not the beginning of the emotional change, but the beginning of the emotional change that's driven by the client's own work and active involvement rather than stuff that's more happening to them, and the emotional change like coming about from hearing people laugh. There's not a hell of a lot of involvement in that other than showing up and seeing what happens. But when you get to the fourth step, you actually have to take some paper and a pen and do some things. So made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now once again, this language isn't exactly to my taste, but I get it. It is appropriate for the time and place in which it was done. There's middle-class white guys with Protestant backgrounds, and so it all makes sense. But what I view this as being is flat out total cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's been going on longer than cognitive behavioral therapy has existed. So AA didn't take a concept and change the language and utilize it. It just happened that that's what they were doing, and it actually is helpful. So what you have there in your handout is a little thing. Bill Wilson was a stockbroker. He had some legal background, and he thought like an accountant. So you're getting something that reminds me of accounting. And so when you're doing your fourth step with your sponsor or with your therapist, and if you know about how to do this, it's very possible that a therapist can help a person with the fourth step more than some of the sponsors. You don't have to go to school to be a sponsor in a 12-step program. You just sort of have to be alive and shown up for a while. And some sponsors are absolutely awesome. They're incredibly insightful and sensitive and loving and caring and helpful, and some aren't. And some can be very damaging. Some can be damaging for certain people, but very helpful to others. Some can be damaging to certain people at a certain time, but to the same person be very helpful at a different time. It varies. In some ways, it's like us clinicians. We each have different strengths and weaknesses, and different people relate to different ones of us in different ways and different times. So it's very similar. But I have found that at times I can help people with their fourth and then fifth step in ways that some people can't. But what the premise is pretty simple. You heard resentment is the number one offender. The number one reason people go back out and use, they get a resentment they can't get over. So how they start the fourth step is they have you list everybody you're resentful at. Okay. Then they have you list the cause, and then what it affected, basically feelings. So it's pretty interesting, pretty insightful. Now I personally get sort of a charge out of some of the things they have listed on this, that the person is resentful at Mr. Brown because of his attention to his wife, and he told his wife about his mistress. It's not terribly balanced. And Brown may get my job at the office, so this guy's a problem. It makes perfect sense to be resentful at him. And so what it affects, my sex relations, self-esteem, and then you see the fear bracketed, security, self-esteem. Mrs. Jones, she's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking. Now, that would be something that would stress an alcoholic out. He's my friend. She's a gossip. I employ unreasonable, unjust, overbearing. Threatens to fire me for drinking and padding my expense account. How dare he? And finally, my wife. Mr. Understands and nags, likes brown. This wants house put in her name. Interestingly, if you were to read Bill Wilson's biographies, he had a lot of issues around women. And if you read his biographies and you read the AA literature, you can see where some of that plays out in some of the things that he's written, especially in the next book, the AA book, the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions. And ironically, I think what he did is hugely helpful to people that need to be in recovery. Because even though he had these problems, and some of which were ongoing throughout his life after he started AA, he had enough insight to lay things out in such a way that helps people deal with things that otherwise and normally would have been totally hidden in the closet and never discussed. So this is where the 3 columns: who you resent, what they did, what it affected. That's not too much there, so you got to list everybody resented. And by the way, they also, after you list your resentments, you also then do a sex inventory, and you do an inventory around fears and around money. So it's pretty thorough, pretty involved. It could keep us therapists busy for several sessions as we go through these things with people. The most common symptoms of emotional insecurity are worry. Oh, actually, let's stop. Let's stop there, because we have this is pretty big stuff. I wanted you to see that and to think about it. But just so you know, we're about to get to the 4th column, and the 4th column is where the cognitive behavioral therapy begins. There's a line that a paragraph that begins something to the effect of referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done. We looked at how we contributed to the problem. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? That's where cognitive behavioral therapy really kicks in a 12-step environment. So we're taking an hour for lunch. Does anybody have any questions before you take off for lunch? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'll see you in an hour. And we got a lot more to cover.
Thank you.
I might need more coffee.